Murders at Karlov Manor has finally been released. Holy hell, I finally said that right. Murders at Markov Manor. The Murders at Markov Manor, and in honor of that, I'm going to count down my top 10 most powerful and playable cards from the set. So for my criteria, it's the cards that I think are going to be the most powerful and see the most play in Commander. So if I show you one of these cards, you're going to think, okay, I likely have a deck for that. And this list is going to include the main set, Murders at Markov Manor. Fucking hell. So this list is going to include the main set, the Murders at Karlov Manor, and also the 4 Commander decks that came along with the set. So before we get into the list, we have one quick honorable mention, and that is Vein Ripper. A 6-mana 6/5 black creature with flying and ward, sacrifice a creature. It says whenever a creature dies, target opponent loses 2 life and you gain 2 life. So people are saying this card is really good, and I don't necessarily disagree with that. The only reason it's on an honorable mention is because 6 mana is a ton of mana for this kind of effect. And like the best thing about cards like Blood Artist and Zulaport Cutthroat is that they can come down on like turn 2, maybe turn 3, and you can get their ping effects for the rest of the game. And even though this doesn't get to come down early unless you reanimate it, I guess, this is like a decent-ish finisher for any Aristocrats type deck. So even though it is pretty hard to kill because of the ward cost, I still think this honorable mention plays just comes down to it not saying each opponent. Number 10 is Hard Hitting Question, a 1-mana green sorcery that says target creature you control deals damage equal to its power to target creature or planeswalker you don't control. So I know this card at first glance seems kind of and you're like, really? You're putting this over Vein Ripper? But this is actually the first 1-mana punch effect. Except for Legolas's Quick Reflexes, which isn't necessarily the same because that has to like tap in order to get the punch effect. And it's also fucking $18. But this is definitely a really good card for any mono green or Gruul deck. And I think I would even consider it for a teamer deck that wants creature removal. Like assuming I was playing a creature deck, I would honestly want this over, I think, Pongify and Rapid Hybridization. And number 8, we have Doppelgang. It's triple X, a green and a blue for a sorcery. For each of X target permanents, create X tokens that are copies of that permanent. I think that this card reads a lot worse than it's going to play out. So this is one of the 2 cards currently in existence that lets you copy any permanent from any side of the table. And this one you can kind of do the Rite of Replication thing where if it's 4 mana, you can just get a copy of 1 creature, or if you pump a shit ton more mana, you can get a huge bonus that'll probably just win you the game on the spot. I think this is going to be a sneakily good card in a lot of Simic decks that like to ramp hard and don't necessarily have a solid plan to close out the game, kind of just like beat face in combat. I think this card is going to be a really good asset for those decks and to let them hit even harder. Number 8 is War Leader's Call, a 3-mana Boros enchantment that says creatures you control get +1/+1, and whenever a creature enters the battlefield under your control, War Leader's Call deals 1 damage to each opponent. A Impact Tremor stapled onto an Anthem is pretty good. Well, I'm not going to say this is a 3-mana Perforos, it is pretty close, and let me explain. So the Impact Tremors mainly goes in, you would say, token decks, right? And token decks, obviously there are exceptions, but for the majority of cases, they make 1/1 tokens. So the War Leader's Call, in addition to dealing 1 damage on entry, it adds a damage whenever a token connects. To be fair, it only deals the 1 extra damage to the player I'm attacking, but it's still pretty damn close. Let me know if that makes sense in the comments. Number 7 is Incinerator of the Guilty, a 6-mana 6/6 red dragon with flying and trample. When it deals combat damage to a player, you may collect evidence X. When you do, Incinerator of the Guilty deals X damage to each creature and each planeswalker that player controls. So collect evidence is exiling a number of cards in your graveyard, and the X will be the total combined mana value of those cards. So the obvious comparison with this card is Balefire Dragon. And I think this card is slightly better because it doesn't get chumped the same way that the Balefire Dragon does. And realistically, you only need to connect with your opponent once in order to wipe their whole board. Like, you will probably want a decent amount of self-mill if you plan on removing multiple opponents' boards, but also that's kind of just, we don't really know how Collect Evidence plays yet. It could be insanely easy to get a ton of like highish mana value cards in your graveyard. But realistically, not much survives a Balefire Dragon hit for 6 anyway, so you're probably going to only need to exile like 4 to 6 mana worth of cards from your yard. So I think this card is maybe not slightly, I don't know if significantly is the right word, but like a pretty decent amount better than Balefire Dragon, which is already a really good card. So I think this card is going to see a ton of play. At number 6, we have Insidious Roots, a 2-mana Golgari enchantment that says creature tokens you control have tapped to add 1 mana of any color, and whenever 1 or more creature cards leave your graveyard, create a 0/1 plant creature token, then put a 1/1 counter on each plant you control. So the obvious comparisons to this are Cryptolithrite, Elven Chorus, and Jahaira. I think that's how you pronounce that. I think it's a little bit better than Cryptolithrite because of the token creation ability, ability, and Cryptolithray is mainly put in token decks anyways. And not to mention the ability to not only create the tokens when things leave your graveyard, but the Avenger of Zendikar-esque pump that gives those tokens. Because like obviously this card is way better in decks that have like a Tor mod that care about like getting cards out of the yard, but I think this is worth a slot in like just normal token decks. Number 5 is Show-Stopping Surprise, a 5-mana red instant. Choose target creature you control. Turn it face up if it's face down, then it deals damage equal to its power to each other creature. So this is one of the weird cards where the more text almost isn't as good, because when you read this you think, okay cool, this is a card that cares about morphs. But this is actually just a Chandra's Ignition that doesn't hit players at instant speed. And sure, while some decks will really want the damage to players with the Ignition if you have like a huge power creature, Chandra's Ignition is realistically just red board wipe number 2 or 3 after Chain Reaction or Blasphemous Act. Like I said, it does get worse if you're playing like big creature decks where the damage to players will be more relevant, but I think the instant capabilities of this card edge it out just a little bit over Chandra's Ignition for me in the majority of decks. Number 4 is Archdruid's Charm. Green, green, green for an instant. Choose one. Search your library for a creature or land and reveal it. Put it onto the battlefield tapped. It's a land card, otherwise put it into your hand then shuffle. Put a 1/1 counter on target creature you control. It deals damage equal to its power to target creature you don't control, and exile target artifact or enchantment. So I've gone over this in a previous video, but to just summarize the points, this is effectively 5 modes in one. It's insanely flexible, and you won't ever be sad to have this in your hand. Obviously the triple green is pretty mana intensive, so make sure you're in a green heavy deck. But the reason I'm like a little bit more down on this card is that while it is very good, don't get me wrong, it's not that like unique, and it doesn't give green players any like thing that they didn't have before, like a bunch of other cards on this list. Obviously if I put an Archdruid's Charm in my deck, it would make it better, but I don't necessarily know if it's something that I'm like excited to put in a sleeve, you know what I mean? I don't know, like this card is very, very good, but it's just like a good card. It doesn't like excite me at all, and I know this list is kind of like not cards that I like, but good cards, and this is a very good card, but it's just like nothing new, you know? Number 3 is Crime Novelist, a 3-mana 1/3 red creature. Whenever you sacrifice an artifact, put a +1/+1 counter on Crime Novelist and add a red. Like, I don't really need to talk that much about this card, do I? Artifact is the #1 most popular theme on EDHREC, and Treasures is fucking number 2 somehow. Not to mention other artifact token decks like food decks, clue decks, etc. Like, doubling up on Treasures is already absurd, and I don't know. There's not much to say about this card. This card's fucking cracked in its specific deck, and we all know it. Number 2 is Delny, Streetwise Lookout, a 3-mana white 2/2. Creatures you control with power 2 or less can't be blocked by creatures with power 3 or greater, and if an ability of a creature you control with power 2 or less triggers, the ability triggers an additional time. Quick mini rant, I don't like how WotC keeps printing these fucking panharmonicons in every single set. Like, they used to be really cool and novel when panharmonicon was the only thing, but now it's just like, quick, print the panharmonicon with a set mechanic. Just like print the counterspell, or print the big red dragon with the set mechanic. Like, it's just lazy card design. It doesn't really reward you for doing anything other than like doing the things you already are doing. Like, players complain about True Lane all the time, just like, oh, reward you for casting creatures. But then they are like, holy shit, yes, I fucking love this roaming throne, when all it does is reward you for playing your deck. Like, panharmonicons are effectively whatever shit happens, that shit happens again. I don't know. Whatever, mini rant over. We all know this card is great, right? Like I mentioned, you've seen how popular and powerful Roaming Throne is. This is basically that, but just color restricted. Like, unless you're in a tribal deck, I think you'll have on average a lot more creatures with power 2 or less than cards that have the same card type as your commander. Because like, you'll definitely want this in your deck if your commander has a triggered ability. Whoa, I know, so difficult, and has power 2 or less. And not to mention like the evasion given to your whole team. Like, we all know this card is like insanely good. If 3 mana doubling up any commander's triggers that you'd want to put it in. Like, we all know this card's good, right? Whatever. I'm just fucking pissed about the panharmonicon thing. Anyway, last card. The final card is Trouble in Pairs, a 4-mana white enchantment. If an opponent would begin an extra turn, that player skips that turn instead. So we got a little bit of flavor text there. And whenever an opponent attacks you with 2 or more creatures, draws their second card each turn, or casts their second spell each turn, you draw a card. So people are calling this the new Rhystic Study or the new Smothering Tithe, and I don't really think they're wrong. Like, this is just a 1-mana insane card advantage engine in white. Because like, people drawing multiple cards or casting multiple spells is insanely common, and you get to draw a card whenever they do that. Prepare for this card to be expensive as hell. I'm saying like 25-30 bucks. because, I mean, given that this is number 1 on my list, this is probably the best card in the whole set, and it's in the least sought after precon, the Boros, like, goad one. Like, people are comparing this to Ristic Study, like I said, for good reason. This card realistically probably draws 1 to 2 cards per opponent per turn cycle. Like, please just treat this like a Ristic Study or a Smothering Tithe, and if somebody plays it, like, I'm not saying rule of law yourself for this, but recognize the card advantage that they are getting from this and try to either blow it up or hit them as much as possible. So that's about it for my list. What did you think? Did you agree with me? Did you disagree? Please let me know your thoughts in the comments below. Do all the YouTube bullshit, like, comment, subscribe, and as always, I hope you have a great day. I just talked a bunch about the new cards in Murders at Karlov Manor, but if you want to see the best reprints that we've had in a while from the same decks, check it out right here. It's the video where I go over these cards, so check it out right here. It's a pretty good video. I think you'll enjoy it.